Welcome to Travel with Sean. I'm Sean, and today we're in Thessaloniki, Greece. If you haven't heard of this city before, and you're a Christian or otherwise familiar with the Bible, the book of Thessalonians was a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church, the Christians in Thessaloniki, Greece, in the first century. In this video, we're going to be looking at church art in Thessaloniki, Greece from the Byzantine era. What's now called the Byzantine Era refers to a time beginning in 330 AD, and in Thessaloniki, it ended in 1430 when the Ottoman Empire conquered the city. Most of the artwork we'll be seeing is believed to be primarily from the early 14th century, although some is older than that, even dating back to the 5th century. Watch to the end to see one of only a few mosaics in the world depicting a beardless Jesus. Sadly, a lot of paintings on the walls of this church were damaged in fire. That was a common hazard for centuries, especially considering that they relied heavily on candles for light. In the Byzantine period, halos became a standard feature in depictions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, angels, and saints. So the artists painted a colored sphere behind their heads, representing the halo. The city was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1430, and all the churches were converted into Muslim mosques. So the frescoes were covered up with plaster to hide them, because the Islamic teachings discouraged the representation of living beings in religious spaces. When the plaster was eventually removed, a lot of times the frescoes under it were damaged in the process. It's interesting to see a fresco that appears to be of crusaders, but not surprising given that the artwork is from the early 1300s. The Crusade of Smyrna, 1344 to 1351, was the most notable crusade that took place in the first half of the 14th century. It was part of the wider effort by the Western European powers to counter the expansion of the Ottoman Turks. We just came from a side chapel in this church, and now we step into the nave where the worshippers attend Eucharist. And you can see that the side chapel was pretty much as heavily painted as the nave. And it wasn't just Jesus, Mary, and the saints who they painted, but also religious leaders from their time. When looking at church art from the Byzantine era, one must not overlook the inside of the dome. The dome of the Hagia Sophia Church is ringed by figures of all 12 apostles and Mary, the mother of Jesus. The figure in the center is of Jesus, with two angels holding his feet. Notice the halo and cross behind his head? When looking at the dome, be sure to look over the rest of the ceiling as well. Another great place to admire the Byzantine era church art is the church's arches, especially the underside. On the underside of the arches in Vladidan Monastery's church, we find scenes from key events in the life of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Sometimes the arches are supported by columns, in which case you'll want to admire the column capitals. A column's capital is the topmost part of the column, serving as a transition between the column and the structure it supports, such as the arch. The capitals in the Church of Panaia Akerapoitos date to the mid-5th century. The church in St. Nicholas Orphanos has some of the best preserved Byzantine frescoes in Thessaloniki. They date from 1310 to 1320. The golden age of Thessaloniki. We've been looking at a lot of frescoes, but the portable art was easier to conceal during the Ottoman invasion of 1430 and to protect over the following centuries. It could also be removed in case of a church fire. The Black Madonna was a popular theme of European artists in the 11th and 12th centuries. Called riza, it was a common practice during the Byzantine era to encase paintings in metal, except for the faces, found primarily on icons, especially those of Jesus, Mary, and the saints. The coverings were typically made of gold, silver, or gilded bronze, sometimes even encrusted with precious stones. The metal cover provided protection from damage. The iconostasis is a solid decorated screen that separates the nave, where the congregation is, from the sanctuary, where the altar is located. It is usually decorated with paintings of religious figures, Jesus, Mary, saints, and or church leaders. This tradition began in the early to mid-14th century. Prior to 1350, churches used what was called a templon, a curtain hung from a stone beam, like what we find in the Church of Saint Nicholas Orphanos. Frequently, the wall behind it is bowed away from the altar. That part of the wall is called the apse, and is frequently painted. The only remaining Byzantine paintings at Church of St. Panteleimon are outside of the church, on the apse and walls of what were side chapels that used to be enclosed by a portico. These were painted shortly after the church was built, around 1300, give or take a couple years. The present decoration of the apse inside the Church of Saint Demetrius is a contemporary interpretation of Byzantine art, aiming to restore the church's historical appearance while honoring its spiritual significance. Sadly, very few of their Byzantine wall paintings survived the Great Fire of 1917 that virtually gutted the Church of Saint Demetrius. We're looking at the apse of the Church of Hosios David, where this mosaic shows a beardless Jesus, the only one of its kind in Greece and one of just a few in the world. A 9th century monk recorded a legend that it was sponsored by the daughter of a Roman emperor who was persecuting Christians, but that legend should be met with skepticism. That emperor died in the early 4th century, and the Edict of Thessaloniki in 380 AD made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Another significant piece of art in this small church is a baptism of Jesus on the underside of the church's southern arch, which dates from around 1190 AD.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for traveling along with me. As always, I appreciate your support. Until next time, bye-bye.